thank you, Archbishop Justin, for your time this afternoon and for this opportunity to write this Lent book on the subject of sharing faith with those around us. And I'd love to just ask you, by way of introduction, why did you think a book on evangelism was important for the church, particularly during the season of Lent?
I thought, first of all, I think it's important for the church because one of the things about the season of Lent is that sense of stripping away the barnacles, the bits that attach to us, and refinding that deep sense of the divine vocation. What are we called to be and do? And I've been very struck in my own devotional reading the last few days by the first chapter of Colossians, which I'm meditating and reflecting on very slowly. And round about verse 24, that sort of area, that Paul says in the oikonomia of God, in the economy of God, in the settlement of God, he is called to proclaim the whole word of God. And I've been reflecting on that phrase, the whole word of God, because it means so much more than just words with a small w. It's the presence, it includes that sense of the word that we find in John 1. It's such a powerful concept. And at the heart of the Christian life, I've said for years, is our call to worship and to witness. And therefore, if we're going to strip away the bits that get added on, if we're going to proclaim the whole word of God, if we are going to find afresh our calling as Christians, Lent is a really good time to renew that sense and to think about what it means to be involved in evangelism in the 21st century.
Thank you. I'd love to have a conversation with you about chapter 1 of this book. Been recording a few conversations with different voices on some of the subjects of this book, and chapter 1 I entitled "The Greatest Story Ever Told," and I talk about the gospel as a narrative, as a story, and evangelism as the invitation to enter into God's story. And I think we can sometimes limit our ideas of evangelism to think it's purely about inviting people to church or inviting people to carol services. And obviously this year has presented lots of limitations in some of those ways we might have traditionally done evangelism. But I wonder whether that idea of evangelism as an invitation into God's story or God's adventure resonates with you, and whether that's something you've experienced in your own life and ministry as a significant way of thinking about sharing faith today.
It resonates very, very strongly indeed, because certainly in my job that there are so many things that are about developing, protecting, dealing with the issues of the institution of the church. But actually, as Archbishop Steele said at the General Synod in November 2020, that if we worry about the institution, we're finished. We need to focus on the story of God. And to draw people into the narrative of God will, as a collateral benefit, lead to a church that flourishes. To try and draw people into the church will not draw people to God. It'll draw people into, at best, activism. And so when you say drawing them into the story of God, that is about coming into the presence of God, that beautiful, the Rublev icon, the space at the front of the Trinity. It's saying, come and join the meal. Come and be part of the story, part of the conversation. Become part of the Acts of the Apostles. You know, I always feel this is a very biblically theological comment, but I always feel that one of the reasons that the Acts seem to end so suddenly is that it hasn't ended. We're actually at the moment on about chapter 10,000 or 100,000 or 10 million or something, in which the story is continually being told. And we are to enter into that story. So what you say really, I think is really important and exciting. And when people look at it that way, they will find the energy, because to talk about Jesus, to bring people into the presence of Jesus Christ, into the story of God, is fun. One of the things I very often do in sermons in my own diocese, when I go into a parish, is whatever else I've been talking about in the sermon, I'll say at the end, now I'm going to get you to do something. They'll look terrified. And I say, look, what I want you to do is turn to the person next to you, or if you haven't got anywhere within reach, just think to yourself and do it to yourself. And in 1 minute, I want to explain why you're a Christian and you go to church. And in many churches, there's a real sort of gasp of horror and people struggle. In others, so there's always some people who find it very easy. And I say, by the way, you're not allowed to use any religious jargon, and I want you to say why you're a Christian and you go to church, not why you go to church by itself. What does Jesus mean to you? Then they look really horrified, and I time them for 1 minute. And I say, okay, by the time I come back, and I turn to the vicar and say, and you're to make sure this happens, I want them to be able to do that in a relaxed way, to give a reason for the faith that is within them, for the hope that is within them. It's quite fun.
That sounds brilliant. One final idea that I raise in this first chapter of the book is, again, thinking about some of the fears that we have in sharing our faith, and one of them is how we come across in evangelism. We all know the sort of terrible stereotype of the very sort of narrow-minded Christian that's forcing their beliefs, and we know we don't want to be like that. And yet in the Gospels, Jesus is so open, and so he's never coercive, is he, in the way that he extends grace. And I wonder whether you have any just reflections on how, as Christians today, we can share our faith in those ways that are just natural and not putting people under pressure to believe or to conform.
Well, what's the first thing that happened in Jesus' life?
Well, other than him being born.
No, including that.
Oh, well, he was born.
And how many people in Bethlehem would have known about that? And how many people outside Bethlehem would have known about that? And when the shepherds went down, what did they find? And when someone was traveling on a trading trip with a trading caravan to Jerusalem some 30-something years later and saw 3 blokes being crucified, would they have said, gosh, that's the Son of God? Or would they have said, weather's very odd today, it's getting dark very quickly, I must get into Jerusalem and find some shelter before the storm breaks? I think one of the most breathtaking parts of things to do with Jesus is the space he gives us to ignore him. Nothing that he does before his return is done in a way that automatically compels people to believe. He lets people walk away from him. As a baby, I mean, what is more helpless? What leaves more space than a baby? It's extraordinary. Or a dying man on a cross, an empty tomb that some women go to in a time where the women's testimony was of no significance. And I just think when we look at that, we realize that one of the characteristics of what Jesus did is his grace is grace to find mercy, but it is also grace to reject him and God. And that's one of the hardest things. So one of the things about our evangelism is it must leave people with space. It must never be manipulative. It must never be too intense, too overwhelming. It must never be horrible in the way that, you know, all the cliches we know of. It's to leave people space. And with that, it must come out of our genuine experience of God. The people who attract me to Jesus are the people who love Jesus and love people, probably because they love Jesus. The people who are really good evangelists love God and they love people, and they're really good at introducing one to the other.
I love that idea. One of the stories I've gone back to again and again, and even mentioned in the book, is Jesus and the rich young ruler. And looks at him and loves him, and he walks away. And I think I'd have probably been racing down the street going, hang on, maybe you didn't understand.
Okay, let's say 50% of all you have. Yeah. Let's do a deal here.
Exactly. So that idea of space, I think, is quite liberating as a disciple of Jesus, because, you know, it's not actually ultimately about me. There's space for God to move and space for the Spirit to be at work. So thank you so much for that thought. I feel that's brought our discussion to a really lovely conclusion, thinking about that idea of giving people space and allowing God's space to move. So thank you so much, Archbishop Justin, for your time today.
Thank you, Hannah, and thank you again for the book. I'm looking forward to its launch.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.